Putin needs more ammunition, needs more technology, needs more microchips, needs more vehicles. What does that say about his defense industrial base that he keeps saying is brilliant and can do anything to defeat Ukraine? Of course, Russian defense exports are going to die completely after Ukraine because their equipment has been proven so poor.
I think the Chinese are pretty cautious. I mean, they may, as Philip is saying, they may be feeling, well, we can afford to do this. I still think they're pretty cautious about it because it would cost an enormous amount. I mean, although Xi has a very elevated view of his own importance, of China finally having its day in the sun, I think they're going to be very careful with Taiwan.
The catastrophic defeat of Putin in Ukraine could cause some sort of political moment in Russia, that leads to the breakup of the Russian Federation, and with it a loss of control of the nuclear weapons. Hi, I'm James Heappey. Welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security on Times Radio. Today, I'm joined by Philip Ingram, a former military intelligence officer, and Michael Binyon, the former Moscow correspondent at the Times with decades of experience reporting on global affairs. In the last year, we've seen the continuation of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Hamas's attack on Israel, and the subsequent war, a heightening of tensions between China, the US, and Taiwan, an ongoing conflict across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But how will these conflicts and developments influence the future of geopolitics and the power struggle between the world's superpowers? Well, Philip, Michael, welcome. And let's start exactly there, because the obvious question is, who are the world's superpowers? In the Cold War, I think we understood that to be the Soviet Union, the US, and their allies within NATO. But arguably, the world has changed a lot since then. So, Michael, who would you say are now the world's superpowers?
Well, America, I think, by all counts, still qualifies as a superpower, both economically and militarily. China also, economically, certainly is a superpower, militarily growing into that league. India creeping up as the world's biggest and most populous country, and economically probably emerging as a very influential force. Europe, well, it's difficult to categorize Europe as a single power. I mean, the European Union collectively, economically very powerful, militarily much less so. It's the phrase superpower, I think it's a bit out of date. You've got nuclear powers, and then you've got economic giants, and they don't necessarily coincide. Russia is an economic dwarf in a way, and as people used to say, even at the time of communism, it was up a volta with rockets. It was a country that was economically very backward, but it did have a formidable nuclear arsenal and still does.
And one of the things that people have been talking about over the last couple of years really is the influence that Xi increasingly has in Moscow. China have stepped in and sustain the Russian war effort to a degree, but that comes at a price. To what degree do you think that Russia now is simply a client of China, or are they still an actor entirely in their own right?
I think they're utterly dependent at the moment, both politically and militarily. They're dependent for political cover. Now that's fairly firm. She has similar interests in weakening what they see as the US stranglehold on world affairs, similar interest to Russia on that. They don't really agree with the Ukraine war. They feel they need to give it backing. Privately, they are urging the Russians, they've certainly urged them privately and publicly, don't you dare use nuclear weapons. But they're also probably positioning themselves for when the Russians feel confident enough to say, right, we're going to just stop now and we'll declare victory, which is probably what may happen. Neither side can actually win an outright military victory there. But I think the Russians, they're in a much better position at the moment. The Ukrainians at some point may be forced to concede, well, at least some kind of concessions, but it will be China that would do the deal, as China is very much the one that calls the shots now in that relationship.
So, Philip, how does this play with a former KGB man, a strong man, a Russian nationalist, now entirely supplicant to Xi?
Well, here's where I disagree slightly. He's increasingly supplicant to Xi, and Xi is buying Russia and buying Russian capability. But in superpower terms, we can talk about military, we can talk about economics, but from a political perspective, the organization that can bring different motions against the world is the United Nations Security Council, and the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council can veto anything. So that's UK, US, Russia, China, and France. So politically, as they've got a global veto, they're probably what the closest you could come to defining a superpower. Putin is working closely with Xi, but they've got different motivations. Xi is looking for the economic growth of China and growing China's economic power. And he had the Belt and Road Initiative. So he's gone through Africa. He's working heavily into South America at the moment. But then this opportunity occurred in Russia to sort of get greater control of Russian natural resources and open up the Russian market to Chinese goods because of the sanctions that have come in from the West. So he's taken that from an opportunistic perspective. Putin wants his political influence. He wants the old Soviet Union back again with him as the tsar in charge of it. But he's, as Michael said, he's never going to be in a position to do that militarily. And economically, he's becoming weaker and weaker and more dependent on China. So Xi can control what it is that's going on in there. They're both trying to suggest that there's a better relationship between them. The advantage that they've both got over the West is that they can think in generational terms or multi-generational terms. We are concerned about when the next presidential or parliamentary election is going to be, or more accurately, what tomorrow morning's headline is going to be, or if Donald Trump gets in, what this afternoon's tweet or X post is going to be. Whereas President Xi in China, you look at what he's doing, he's got a 25-year plan. He's taking little nibbles of things in different parts of the world. And this is where, if we do get to a point where there is a peace deal in Ukraine which cedes any form of territory to Russia that they have captured militarily, Xi Jinping will make the decision as to whether he can economically ride out the storm that would come if he militarily took Taiwan back under control or not. And I fear that if there is that sort of peace deal pushed in, Xi Jinping will go, I can handle 5 years of economic pressure, and we know that we can bring the world back on again, so I'm going to go for it. And what that would do is potentially solve something in Europe, but would stimulate a much greater and more globally focused potential conflict.
And that is, that has always struck me as the key difference between the competition that's emerging now versus the competition of the Cold War. The Cold War came on the back of a moment of great global fissure with the Second World War, and in any case, trade and supply chains within manufacturing were simply not as globalized. So whatever this competition is, it's not going to play out in a world that is entirely decoupled between two rival spheres. And so that changes the nature of it, exactly to your point about Xi's calculation about how long a consumerist West can punish China for after some sort of outrage. But it feels to me, Michael, that there's still a very big difference between Russia as an actor. They have a sense of an entitlement to their near abroad, to protect their sphere of influence. China's geographic aim feels much more limited to its claim over the South China Sea, and beyond that, exactly as we've discussed, it's a protection of its global supply chains and a protection of its position of economic dominance. Am I misreading that? Is China a more ambitious power territorially?
I think you're right. I don't think it's ambitious in the sense that they want to control other territories, but they want other territories to recognize Chinese hegemony in that area. That, well, not just in South Asia, but along the whole Belt and Road, the client states they built up in Africa and elsewhere. China, yes, its economic future is the main driving force. And for that reason, China doesn't actually want a complete break with the West. It doesn't want the kind of pariah status or would certainly not welcome Western sanctions of any kind. And that's a potential area of conflict with Russia. I mean, the Chinese are quite wary about supplying Russia with the kind of kit that might then get secondary sanctions from the West on the Chinese, because they still value their Western markets, which overwhelmingly are more important to them than the Russian market. I mean, yes, they can buy the oil cheaply from Russia, they can sell stuff, but Russia basically is not a very big buyer of Chinese goods by comparison with, say, America or other countries. And there is another underlying factor, which is that the Russians have an age-old fear of China. I mean, they, in their bones, are worried about what they would crudely call the yellow peril and that sort of thing. I mean, that's a sort of stereotype that they have in their minds going way back centuries. Yes, the near abroad is important to them. They see that the Slavs, they want the Slavs, particularly Ukraine and Belarus. Well, they've more or less got Belarus, and that's why Ukraine is so important to them. Should be part of the, the global Slavic community. But the difference between these conflicts then and now is that previously it was an ideological conflict. And therefore you got these kind of alliances between ideologies. You got Mao's China sort of fighting the same fight as Russia, particularly way back in Stalin's day. It's not ideological now. It's national. It's national interest and nationalistic ambitions. And these don't always fit together. I mean, the ideology of China is not the same as the ideology of Russia in any way. And it's an opportunistic alliance, which at the moment is very suitable for both.
So I mean, I'm struck with that. You read a lot now in sort of geopolitical articles about the CRINKs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And yes, undoubtedly, Philip, over the last few years, we've seen those countries exchanging technologies and supporting each other, principally support Russia in Ukraine. But it's not an ideological alignment. No. It's just a sort of marriage of convenience. To what degree is the CRINK a thing as a military force?
I think it's increasing in importance because of the potential threat that it's giving to the West. And this is where we've got a conflict in Europe, we've got a growing instability in the Middle East that could turn into a conflict, and we've got China being expansionist in certain areas in Southeast Asia, which could lead to regional conflict and other bits and pieces. And we're seeing a swapping of military technologies. We're seeing logistic support going around the CRINK groups that are in there. But everyone's got their different motivations. Vladimir Putin needs more ammunition, needs more technology, needs more microchips, needs more vehicles. What does that say about his defense industrial base that he keeps saying is brilliant and can do anything to defeat Ukraine? He's relying on Iran to supply technology and drones and all the rest of it, North Korea to supply ammunition. Russia is using North Korea and Iran as a backdoor method of not supplying directly so that they don't fall into the game of Russian sanctions. Russia's using it as a way of testing some of their technologies out, but they don't want stuff to go in so obviously in case it fails, and that reduces confidence in Chinese defense manufacturing, therefore Chinese defense exports. Of course, Russian defense exports are going to die completely after Ukraine because their equipment has been proven so poor against Western weapons. So China sees an opportunity there to the countries that don't want to do deals with the West. Iran is sitting there watching very closely, and Iran is taking stuff from North Korea, it's taking support from China, it can sell its oil outside sanctions, but it wants nuclear technology. So that's why it's helping Russia. And it wouldn't surprise me if under the table, Iran is continuously pushing to say, we'll give you even more, we'll give you even more if you give us a nuclear weapon, if you give us nuclear technology. And therefore it's all different motivations. So it's a marriage of convenience at the moment. Whether it'll last or not, I don't know, but they're all thinking much longer term ahead than we are. So that's where it's worrying. And if it does come together, if something gels it like an increased global conflict, then we're potentially in trouble.
And I mean, I think that people like me, actually, I've sort of been on TV cameras over the last couple of years, rather sort of smugly saying to Putin, look, you've compromised all of your most sophisticated land weapon systems. There's plenty in the maritime domain and the air domain that we haven't seen a ton of in Ukraine.
Well, the Black Sea Fleet.
Some ships have gone to the bottom, but in the Northern Fleet, there's still there's still submarines that we've not really dealt with. But in the land domain, things like S-400, which were top secret intelligence, that's the air defense system, top secret intelligence requirement for the West 2.5 years ago, we've now got one that we've kind of taken apart and it's all been compromised. And so we kind of think, well, brilliant, Ukraine is a battle lab for NATO and for the donor community, and we're now advancing our military technology at pace. But so too is Ukraine a battle lab for North Korea
and China
and Iran.
I
wouldn't be at all surprised if Chinese staff officers weren't in Russian headquarters. The people sort of say rather complacently that the PLA might generate all the mass, but it has no war fighting nous. Well, maybe China is kind of putting itself into Russian HQs in order to sort of gain some of that war fighting experience.
The majority of the UAV technology that we're seeing that are being used successfully by the Russians and Ukrainians are being sourced from China, commercial Chinese sources, and therefore countering that. And I've seen pictures very recently of electronic warfare boxes
Yes.
that have clearly got Chinese antenna and labels on them and all the rest of it. So it is a battle lab.
So where, there's the risk is that this is a sort of 30, 40, 50-year competition. A competition, I don't know, between democracies and autocracies, East and West, pick your label. I mean, I think it's quite hard to define exactly what it is, within which a shot may never be fired. It might just be a competition that's played out through votes in the United Nations or, and who gets to control the world order that exists in 2050. But where, as an experienced watcher of these things, where are the points of crisis that you think could explode this into something hotter?
Gosh, hard to say. Well, obviously the hot wars that are going on at the moment, which have regional implications. I mean, Ukraine, I think, may be contained within Europe. I don't think that's going to spill over into other parts of the world. But I mean, that is a very serious conflict. And the real worry is that it will again become a direct NATO-Russia conflict. I mean, that is what the Americans have been worried about right from the start. And that is why they've had these bans on using weapons to attack deep into Russia itself, because they fear that that would be a provocation that the Russians would respond to. Whether they will respond, I don't think they will respond with even tactical nuclear weapons, because they know exactly where that could lead. But the idea of a direct NATO-Russia conflict is still pretty much limiting the danger of that war spreading. Gaza is a different thing. I mean, Gaza is a very nasty war, lots and lots of people getting killed, potential for huge regional instability and conflict. Surprisingly, the Arab world has been very moderate and quiet in its reaction, partly because they're afraid of the Arab street. They're afraid of a huge uprising, a huge kind of anti-Western, anti-American feeling that the Americans are running this show with arming Israel and that Palestinians are getting killed in large numbers. But the Arab governments know quite well that if they kind of allow that nationalistic wave to sweep everything aside, they'll end up with the sort of chaos that they saw originally in Iran, and they don't welcome Iranian domination of the region at all. So I do think there is a danger, as always, of a flashpoint in the Middle East spreading out to, Iran and possibly the wider Muslim world. I mean, people forget that there is kind of a large Muslim solidarity that extends even into Western countries. I mean, large Muslim minorities who feel very upset by what's going on at the moment. That is always a potential flashpoint. Then other areas, well, it's more economic competition, or it's the real danger is internal breakdown of law and order, aspirations that can't be fulfilled. Look at, say, South Africa. That is a country that has dismally failed its aspirations. And there is the real worry that sort of organized crime, drug gangs, international drug trafficking, and all that will overtake whole countries, as we've seen perhaps in Ecuador and other places, where these global forces are very difficult to contain by governments or indeed by responsible international bodies. So there are plenty of potential flashpoints. I don't see a single flashpoint that's going to set off nuclear Armageddon straight away.
Yeah.
Even the Taiwan trigger?
Well, I think the Chinese are pretty cautious. I mean, they may, Philip is saying, they may be feeling, well, we can afford to do this. I still think they're pretty cautious about it because it would cost an enormous amount, either in terms of their own interests being jeopardized. I mean, they would lose export markets all over the place. It would not necessarily be very popular internally. And at the moment, economically, they're struggling a bit. I mean, their economy is not in a really good shape. I mean, by comparison with many other countries, they're doing fine. But by comparison with what they've known in the past, it's not doing terribly well. A real problem with property that's gone wrong, a sort of property bust, and various other things. So I don't think, I mean, although she has a very elevated view of his own importance of China finally having its day in the sun, I think they're going to be very careful with Taiwan.
Philip, the Cold War, when it did defrost, it defrosted through the superpowers sponsoring proxies to play out their competition. You can see Russia doing that already. It's sort of part of the Kremlin playbook. But can you see China? I sort of agree with Michael. I think China's very unlikely to fight over anything but Taiwan, and even that is moot. I can't see China directly fighting to protect its interests across the Belt and Road Initiative. But can you see China sponsoring proxies, if its interests are challenged?
Well, I think there's another domain that is being influenced at the moment, which is the biggest flashpoint, and that's our democratic processes and our democratic principles. Because what is happening at the moment is that those are being undermined in the information sphere.
Yes.
And that's been tested by Hamas in Gaza, an organization that cannot militarily beat Israel. They know they can't, but strategically they are really kicking them quite hard with all of the information and the way they're controlling it that's coming out. Vladimir Putin was a past master at it and is still working very hard in the elections and everything else. And we're seeing that in the results of European elections that have just come out, an increased polarization where people are shifting to the right. But the reality is people are shifting into more extreme pockets. And what will that stimulate in America? This is what China wants. It'll stimulate greater America first and inwardly focus rather than a global focus. That allows China to continue what it's trying to do on a global perspective. So meets their longer term aspirations. So Xi Jinping has been very clever. He's staying in the background. He's not making lots of noise. He's not doing a lot of things. He's being quite aggressive in Southeast Asia, the South China Seas and the East China Seas. He's generating brand new Chinese territory out of islands he is artificially creating. That's giving him economic zones to control. Vietnam has just realized that you can do that, and they're trying to counter what China is doing by doing exactly the same themselves. Militarily, China is probably 3 to 5 years off having the optimal military capability it would need to retake or to take Taiwan and then protect the fallout from any Western reaction. So, and again, I agree that China doesn't want to do that because of the economic shock it would suffer, and it's not in a strong enough position to do that at the moment. So, but my biggest fear is this, undermining where we are democratically, because we've got politics by soundbite, not substance now. They recognise that and they're exploiting it.
We've been very adversary focused thus far. There is an incoherence to the West. The NATO Article 5, I think, is still ironclad, set in stone, although I think Putin would fancy himself at being able to create a circumstance within which the North Atlantic Council would struggle to find consensus. And I think it's really important that NATO continues to reinvigorate itself so that opportunity for Putin never really emerges. But the West has always been very ambiguous over the Taiwan trigger. In fact, our foreign policy, UK foreign policy, is that Taiwan is part of one China. So does the West need to be clearer with Xi about what the red line is, what it is that we're seeking to deter?
Well, maybe, yes. Over Taiwan, there is what they call strategic ambiguity, which in itself seems a rather crazy policy. I mean, how can you have a policy that's neither clear one way nor the other? I mean, the Americans, as the West generally recognizes a one-China policy. And it does recognize that Taiwan effectively is not an independent country. And yet it treats Taiwan as though it is independent. And so does the rest of the world, well, certainly the Western world, because Taiwan is economically extremely successful and important. It supplies so many of the global chips that are needed and various other things that mean that it has a presence in the global community way beyond its political importance. For China to take it by force, I think would set a very difficult precedent for the West. And that's why the West has been sort of warning China, don't do it. It's sort of suggesting China could do it by consensus, as it were. The trouble is that the Hong Kong example is not a very good one. That was meant to be an international treaty lasting 50 years, which allowed Hong Kong complete freedom to run its own systems and, 2 systems, 1 country kind of thing. But that's effectively been brought to an end just like that.
Yes.
I mean, it's maybe there in principle, but it's not there in practice at all.
So it's interesting that we've been speaking for 15 minutes or so, and the nature of the competition has been sort of set out in a profoundly non-military way. It's a sort of an economic competition and a competition over influence. But maybe I'm just being the kind of the thick old soldier. But it feels to me that the competition only gets played out in that way if the hard power exists on both sides to kind of mutually deter. So, and the way that defence budgets are rising across the West and indeed within China and Russia suggests that everybody kind of gets that. Philip, what are people tooling up for? Is it just for deterrence, or do you think that there is a war coming in the next 20 years or so?
Well, deterrence only exists if you're prepared for the next conflict.
Yeah.
So you have to tool up for the next conflict. And people forget. People see this massive expenditure in the military, and they say, this is leading to war. The military just want war and all the rest of it. The military are there. They're an arm of diplomacy, and they're only used whenever political diplomacy and government fails. I can't remember who it was that quoted, but war is just diplomacy by other means. When you look at that, and a war is only finished through diplomacy and through talking. So it's a political weapon, the military, when it gets engaged, and that's the real difficulty that's out there. But if you don't prepare for conflict, and in preparation, what that tends to do is it tends to help domestic economies, because you build most of your weapons that you need in your supply chains and all the rest of it at home. Yes. The $60 billion that's going to Ukraine is not being given as a nice check to Zelensky and it goes in his bank account and he earns interest on it. It's being spent in US industry, creating US jobs, creating more US technical training, creating better supply chains.
When my time in the UK MOD, and I know that in the Aussie MOD, the Japanese MOD, even in the DOD, they were sort of exposed to the same tensions, because there's a tension between reacting to the chronic challenge of Russia and China globally, which requires armed forces that you can disperse. If you can't compete with the Chinese economic effort, then you can compete by providing security and being a trusted partner and everything else. But if you do that, you arguably do it at the expense of a war-fighting force held in contingency at home. Now, you'd like to say, okay, well, fine, we'll have a sort of war-fighting force held at contingency and have a force that you disperse around the world to operate, but that's blooming expensive. Mm-hmm. So, Michael, what would you, if I made you Secretary of State for Defence in the UK or the US or Australia or France, would you seek to amass the big force to tell Xi that we're ready for you? Or would you amass the force that you could use a tool of diplomacy to sort of compete in the chronic competition?
Well, I think you would certainly try to amass a force that is a deterrent one, but it doesn't necessarily need to look as though it's an aggressive one. It's got to be multifaceted. You've got to use, diplomacy overall should be the main aim. I mean, the real problem of defense preparedness, I think, is a problem for Europe in particular. Yeah. Europe has had a free ride for a long time. And Trump has made it very clear that Europe's not getting a free ride for long. And even I think the Democrats are beginning to think, look, Europe needs to pay more for its own defense. Mm-hmm. And there is a big mood in America, not just an isolationist mood, but a mood that, Europe needs to step up to the plate. And this translates into how much Europe will spend on defense. Mm. I mean, there was a wonderful time when there was a tax-cutting party in Denmark, and they came to power, but with a slogan. I mean, they quickly faded away again. But they said that for defense, they would have microphones installed at every frontier with recordings in Russian saying, "We surrender." And that was their defense policy, because then they could free up the entire army and not spend anything on it. And to some extent, that has been Europe's policy for quite a while. Now, they do have to build up alliances that are more coherent. I mean, NATO has had an amazing invigoration because of Ukraine. Whether and how long that will last, I'm not sure. But what's interesting is they're building up a similar kind of pact in the Far East now with the AUKUS agreement. And this is Australia and US and Britain. Now, at the heart of it is a nuclear element, nuclear submarines for Australia. But there's talk of bringing in others, in particular Japan, which, of course, the Chinese find very threatening.
Yes.
The Chinese have long, historic and very bitter memories of Japan. At the moment, the Japanese feel that China is, they're a bit frightened of China. But the tensions are there. And if Japan is openly involved in some kind of Eastern NATO, I think that is quite it's got to be handled very carefully. I mean, you've got to make sure you've got a coherence and a deterrence, but it mustn't look as though you're suddenly getting a jump on the other side, because they will react equally aggressively.
Yes. The thing that perplexes me about China is, they're obviously concerned to mark out their territory in the South China Sea and sort of create a barrier in the first and second island chain to thwart an American military response. And yet they're building in the PLA Navy, I think they've now 370 active warships compared to the US's 291. That hints at a more global ambition. So what in your view is China up to? It's not just the first and second island chain, it's more than that.
This is what concerns me about the whole of Southeast Asia, and it's the development of what we in the military call power projection capability. China's just launched its third aircraft carrier. You have an aircraft carrier because you want to take an air capability to somewhere to provide you that air defense and that capability to do something. They're generating their marine capability and everything else. That's been recognized by India, who have an ambition now for 5 aircraft carriers. It's just come out in recent weeks. It's been recognized by Japan. And if there's anyone going to go in and militarily support Taiwan, I think it would be Japan, because their economy would be affected fastest by the loss of the chip-making capability, and they wouldn't want that to go into control of China. And that could stimulate the whole regional conflict. But Japan, in recent years, has changed its constitution. It's changed its constitution to allow it to develop a power projection capability. So its helicopter carrier is now getting F-35, so it's an aircraft carrier. It's developing a marine capability that it said it can project forward to protect our islands of interest and importance. Well, Taiwan is something like that. And Japan is at the center of trying to bring this southern NATO together, this alliance together, and get itself into it so it can influence it. We're seeing increasing relationships between all of the Western nations and Japan militarily, and that's not by accident in what's going on. So that power projection, China will turn around and say we're an increasingly global power. Well, yes, they're a P5 member. They've invested a lot in Africa. They're investing a lot in South America, so they want to protect those investments. But again, if they're doing that from if it's purely economical investment, do they need to protect it? What's the threat against it? And therefore, why are they spending so much money on this power projection capability to take big chunks of military, take it somewhere and do something if they're not planning to do something?
Now, accepting Michael's caution in the very first answer around the term superpower, it feels that any conversation about superpowers, whatever term we want to apply, is incomplete without recognizing that for the last 70 years, superpower has been underpinned by nuclear power. Is that still the case? Is fundamentally the hard power that underpins your preeminence on the global stage about your nuclear stockpile, or has the world changed?
It's very difficult to say, because the nuclear stockpile is entirely theoretical. I mean, once you start using it, you only need one to wreak absolute devastation on your enemy. The fact whether you have 500 missiles or 1,000 warheads or whatever, I mean, it's purely theoretical in a way, because then the idea is, if you're going to have a nuclear exchange that goes on back and forth, till you use up all 1,000, I mean, the world is gone. The entire world is devastated. Its nuclear deterrence is a sort of bluff in a way, because nobody really dares call it. And we're coming to the edge of whether people will call it in the whole Ukraine thing, with hotheads, or those pretending to be hotheads, posing as hotheads, like Medvedev in Moscow, calling for the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, luckily, I think Putin is somewhat, I mean, you may feel that Putin is megalomaniac and all that, but I think he's quite shrewd in other ways. And I don't think Russia's on the verge of doing that or listening to that, because nuclear has been the ultimate deterrent, in that if you have a nuclear weapon and you threaten to use it, and it looks as though you might use it, then you really do have some influence. That's the worry about North Korea. It doesn't look as though they're restrained by anything. You want to develop the thing, and then they seem quite ready to use it.
Yes.
And that is really where, that's the crunch point, whether you will use it. How many are in the stockpiles? Well, yes, I mean, it's sort of on paper a balance, and you have the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, which throughout the Cold War were trying to limit these. They've mostly expired, these treaties. And for example, the SALT Treaty, I mean, the Russians left it last year, and it did limit nuclear warheads to, I think, was it 500? I think 1,500. I mean, you would know the actual number, but it limited to 1,550.
Yeah. The numbers were brought right down.
Deployable warheads.
Exactly. But then the bluff comes in that, well, we have to keep stockpiles to replace the ones that are going out of date.
Yes.
So our numbers are always going to be bigger.
Yes.
The numbers game isn't the important game.
No.
And I think we have to recognise that the policy of mutually assured destruction has kept or contributed to keeping the peace. I'll not say it's been the solely responsible peace between the superpowers, in inverted commas, since the end of the Second World War. But nuclear proliferation has changed that. And the first element that changed that was the India and Pakistan acquiring nuclear weapons and the threatening between them. There was always this possibility that they'd use it between them, but that wouldn't stimulate a global conflict. And then we've got other countries getting nuclear weapons. I think it's now becoming increasingly in the public domain that Israel has got access to nuclear weapons, and we've got North Korea, and we know North Korea's got there, and we've got that plausibly deniable little bad boy who is completely unpredictable but is under the control of Russia and China, has got weapons that he can use to threaten around the area and influence what's going on geopolitically elsewhere. There are other nations trying to acquire capability and may or may not have bought warheads. And there's going to be, with this increasing instability, the potential for them to get warheads through fair means or foul. And that's what is going to upset the whole nuclear threat that there is, because we're not going to go to full mutually assured destruction because one or two countries have a small nuclear exchange.
Yes. I mean, I think what's been interesting to me is that there have been sort of three scenarios that have really concerned us as kind of Western ministers over the last couple of years. One is that the catastrophic defeat of Putin in Ukraine could cause some sort of political moment in Russia that leads to the breakup of the Russian Federation and with it a loss of control of the nuclear weapons, very similar to the concern over the nuclear weapons in the Stans at the end of the Cold War. The second is that Russia broke the nuclear taboo with tactical nuclear weapon use. And that when that taboo was broken, what then? Would there be a rush to proliferate? And the same scenario with Iranian nuclear breakout. Would that, if Iran gets the bomb, would Saudi demand that Pakistan gives them the technology and then what? And it just reminds us just how dangerous that nuclear scenario is and how it sort of exists as a constant at that sort of grand strategic level. But what's interesting, Michael, is that Xi has been an incredibly responsible actor in seeking to keep a lid on that nuclear taboo, which suggests that China recognizes the role it now plays as a superpower and the dance that's required to be that power.
That's very encouraging, and I agree with you entirely. I think she has been responsible in a global sense, and China knows now it is the second so-called superpower. China and America have a responsibility to some extent, even if they don't acknowledge it. Well, America certainly acknowledges it, but they do have a responsibility for world peace and world security. I mean, in both countries, there are perhaps rumblings that why should we take on this burden? I mean, we see this with the Trump supporters saying, America for the Americans and to hell with the rest of the world, it's not our deal. But she has been very responsible. I think he's been quite careful in making sure that he's part of and influenced by the global conversation over security. They have played a reasonably responsible role in the Security Council, particularly with sort of smaller conflicts. Things where you would think that there's not much interest in what to do about some regional conflict. But the Chinese have been responsible for it. They haven't seen it simply in terms of winners and losers, which was the problem with the Security Council during the Cold War, where every little minor conflict became, are you with the commies or are you with us? That was the judgment. Now, not so. So yes, I would simply agree. I think he has been a responsible leader of China.
That's all we've time for, I'm afraid. Thank you to my guests, Philip and Michael. This is Superpowers, the future of global security on Times Radio. For the latest in geopolitics and future episodes of Superpowers, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You're very welcome, and we'd love to hear in the comments what you would like us to discuss on future episodes. Thanks for watching.